I want to welcome you to this particular lecture. I wanted a chance to summarize where we've been, what we've done with some of these Zoom lessons. I know not all of you have been able to join, and so I wanted just a brief opportunity to talk with you about some of the material that we've covered. So we've talked about leadership, obviously, and talked about leadership through the lens of Paul, his life and ministry, and what we could learn. I'm here in the chapel at Founders Hall, and this is where I've hosted most of these sessions. But today, what I want to do is focus in on a couple of points. I want to back up for a minute and talk to you about leadership. What is leadership? How would you define it? What does that look like? How's that to be lived out? And I would. Part of what I did the last time we met is we talked about leadership as influence, and that all of us have influence. And so the real question is a question of how to use how would we use that influence. So we talked a bit about that. We talked about the difference in legislative and executive kind of leadership. I mean, the truth of the matter is, executive kind of leadership is positional leadership, where you have a position of authority, and what you do in leadership, you do from a position of power. Where legislative leadership is more about influence and about helping people come to make decisions and getting buy-in, those kinds of things with leadership. That's a big part of leadership. And we talked a bit about Paul and how in Paul's life he used a little of both. Most of the time, Paul was really an example of servant leadership. But there were times when he could be, well, how shall we say, he could use executive kind of leadership. He would occasionally talk about being an apostle, about being called of God. He sometimes had to defend his own credentials because of critics. But nonetheless, all of that a way to kind of segue into what I want to really talk with you about now, and that is learning to contend for what matters in leadership. In leadership, you're not going to simply be able to float down the stream and not cause any ripples or waves yourself. Leaders by nature are there to affect change, to be a change agent. And when you try to do that, you're going to run into some challenges. You're going to run into conflict. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. When I was a couple of years ago, I was invited to be part of a play that happened over in Decatur at the Princess Theater. It was around Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday, and there was an actor that had been hired from Birmingham that had memorized the letters from the Birmingham jail of King's. And so actually what happened is they had invited several of us to serve on a panel and have a panel discussion. Or actually on the panel what we were told to do is read letters from people who had served as white ministers in the city of Birmingham during the time when King was writing, and even in the time when King was in prison there in Birmingham. And so I played the part of a First Baptist Church, Birmingham, a white church, and I played the part of that pastor and read letters back and forth to the man who was on stage portraying Martin Luther King Jr. But the interesting thing about that event for me was that what happened afterwards is they opened that up for discussion. The audience could ask questions, and I assumed that any question would be directed to the actor himself. He'd done a magnificent job of memorizing that text. But what was asked that day of those of us who served on the panel of white ministers, so if you had lived at the time King marched, what would you have done? It's a fair question. It was a little unnerving. It got very quiet. No one wanted to answer. Finally, someone said, well, I'm not sure. Another long silence. And then I finally spoke up and said, so here's the truth. I probably would have done enough to get myself in trouble, but not enough to make a real difference. And then she had the follow-up question. Well, in that case, she said, what are you going to do about the challenges and the issues of our time? And it was a question that I live with to this day because it's a fair question. It's a good question. And so in leadership, the question in front of all of us is, so what are you doing to make a difference about the issues of our time? Now, look, here's the thing. There are going to be times when you want to try to not get involved in conflict, when people are going to try to triangle you into something, or they're going to try to draw you into a conflict. You have to have the wisdom to know when to enter into a conflict or when to walk away from a conflict. The problem with leadership is that the thing is, you can't be a person who just always wants to be in the middle of a fray. You're never going to get anything accomplished. The other side is you have to have courage. You have to have the courage at times to step up and be heard. And that's not easy as well. So you have to learn to, on the one hand, avoid conflict. Paul is a good example on this. When he went to Corinth, in the Corinthian letters, when he went to Corinth, people were trying to draw him into this controversy about, some people say they're from Apollos, and some say they're of Paul, and some say they're of Christ. There was already a division there. And Paul basically walks away from it and says, you know what, I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you. He's not going to be pulled into that particular controversy. He's going to avoid that conflict. And there's wisdom in knowing when to do that as a leader. You have to be able to know when to do that. The other thing is, you've got to also know when to engage in conflict. As a matter of fact, in leadership, there are going to be things that happen. There are going to be times in your life when you are going to be called on to stand up and be counted. This happens in Acts 15 for Paul. It's known as the Jerusalem Conference. I mean, is there anything that you believe in so deeply that you're willing to risk, to take a stand, to be misunderstood, to be talked about, to be maligned? Maybe people won't follow. What are those issues for you as a leader? For Paul, one of them was, the big thing was, it had to do with inclusion. The Gentiles being included in the church itself became a big part of his leadership in the Jerusalem Council. The Jews believed, at least some of them believed, that the gospel of Jesus Christ should be restricted simply to those to that Jewish community, and of course Paul believed that the Gentiles were to be included. He believed that a big part of his work was actually to preach and teach and lead the Gentiles. So inclusion was a big issue. Another issue is grace. Paul believed a great deal in grace. As a matter of fact, he warned the Galatians about reverting back to the law. For freedom Christ has set us free, he said. And so Paul had some things that he was willing to stand up for and even fight for, contend for. Every place that Paul ever went, really, he was contending for grace and for inclusion in the church. People were sometimes wanting to revert back to the law, for legalism to become a part of what they were doing, and Paul refused that. He wouldn't do that, and of course he was engaged in conflict at times. And so here's the thing: leadership requires both courage and conviction. It requires a measure of wisdom and a lot of grace, and it also requires that, an understanding of conflict. You have to realize as a leader, conflict is going to be inevitable. You have to know something about yourself as well in that. You've got to be slow to initiate conflict, but you also, in the middle of conflict, you've got to be able to demonstrate a calm sense of self-differentiation in leadership. Family systems is something a man named Edwin Friedman has taught me a lot about in his writings, Generation to Generation and A Nerve of Failure, both important works. And he talks about a leader that is able to be a calming influence when there's conflict in the air, that you don't allow anxiety to sabotage whatever change is necessary. that you don't allow conflict to sever ties with people, that you stay connected, and at the same time have a very strong sense of who you are and what you believe, and you're able to articulate that, but you do that in a non-threatening kind of way. To be able to navigate conflict that way is a powerful way to lead. Paul, at his best, did those things. Paul was able to do that at his best. Not always, but many times, there are many occasions in Paul's ministry when he's able to offer that kind of pastoral presence when he was teaching. Even in moments when there was conflict, he often would provide a pastoral kind of presence in his letters, in the words that he used. And so I offer that as a way to just say, as you think through the reading, it's easy sometimes theoretically to say, well, Paul lived a long time ago, and he did. And we don't fully understand that culture. We don't. But the other side is there are leadership lessons we can glean from his example and of how to navigate through a time of conflict. So that's a part of what we talked about this last session. And I will lead us in another discussion pretty quickly. So you'll see another video in the near future. So I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're working on your paper, and if I can help, let me know. Take care, and I'll check in later.